now welcome once more to The Miracle of America, the study of the American heritage in the Constitution. We're now on the last part of Lesson 13, and we are studying the last 16 amendments of the Constitution, and we are now beginning with the 18th Amendment. And that's an exciting place to begin our lesson for this particular session, because the 18th Amendment was the result of a long labor of many people trying to bring alcoholic beverages under control. Now, you might be interested to know, in your outline, you'll turn to the 18th Amendment and fill in some blanks here with me. You might be interested to know that this great campaign of women and children, this great drive to try and get the saloons and alcohol under control, extended from all during that period from Civil War on. By 1900, 5 states had adopted statewide prohibition against alcoholic beverages. 5. All right, capital B. By 1916, 19 states had gone dry. 19 states. Statewide prohibition. And right after that, 1917, World War I broke out. And it was considered a waste of resources to manufacture alcohol. And so that's your blank under capital C, waste. As a matter of fact, the Lever Act, which gave control over food production, absolutely outlawed production of alcohol for consumption. So waste is capital C. Now, after the war was over, it was felt that this had been so successful. People were taking their paychecks home now. There was not so much drunkenness. The saloons were closed. Everybody felt maybe this was an improvement. And so they absolutely wiped out alcoholic consumption in a very sweeping amendment to the Constitution. It would have been much easier to handle if it had been a legislative act by Congress rather than an amendment, because it could have been adjusted and changed a little bit at a time. Because it definitely had some very bad weaknesses in it. Anyway, it went sweeping through as an amendment to the Constitution and was adopted by every state in the Union except 2. So you can see the strong sentiment that was behind it at the time. Capital D is 2. All right? This amendment outlawed the manufacture of alcoholic beverages or the transportation of alcohol across state lines. And it provided that the Congress and the several states would have joint jurisdiction in enforcing it. All right, capital C. It said that this had to be adopted within 7 years or it became inoperative. That's the first time an amendment had a limitation like that on it. So you've got 7. And many of the amendments since have always had that limitation, because otherwise amendments just stayed on the books for 50 years. Never were adopted by enough states but stayed alive. This way they would automatically be wiped out if they were not passed within the required time. And now federal enforcement machinery, this is Roman numeral 3, federal enforcement machinery was kind of tough. I'll tell you, after it went dry, it was kind of interesting to have a neighbor say, by the way, would you like a little pre-prohibition scotch? And all of a sudden, some people got very thirsty. Oh, yes, I wouldn't mind a bit if you just happen to have a little. So it became a social sort of lubricant to pass around a drink. And the next thing you know, something else happened too. We had a lot of Americans who considered wine and beer part of their meals, food. And so they were making home brew for that purpose. And that began to get distributed around. And the price began to go up. As alcohol became scarce after Prohibition, price went up, the gangsters came in. So capital A is lighter. They should have made allowances probably for lighter things like wine and beer, which some large segments of our society were using as food, part of their diets. Capital B, anyway, as alcohol in all forms began to become scarce, that's when the bootlegging began. And C, the prices went up, and that's when the gangsters came in. Big-time gangsters. All right, by 1932, rum running, racketeering, and the criminal violence associated with liquor made prohibition very unpopular, and the 21st Amendment was adopted in 1933, repealing it. That's your blank. Capital D is 21. All right, now we come to an interesting amendment. As far as all the ladies in the audience are concerned, that's the 19th Amendment, giving the women the right to vote. Now, they'd been agitating for this for a long time. And it's kind of interesting because Wyoming Territory gave women the right to vote way back in 1869. That's your first blank. And Utah gave women the right to vote in 1870, but it was still a federal territory. By 1900, only 4 states were allowing women to vote. 4 states. By 1916, 11 states finally said we ought to let the women vote. And then during World War I, President Wilson came out strongly for it. Now, it's interesting, Woodrow Wilson was against it, really, but it became so popular to have the women all vote that, it was good politics, so he came along with it. But he had no confidence in the women vote. He said secretly, well, a lot of other men did. And sometimes women, they talk about the men being chauvinistic, and keeping them from voting for a long time. Well, actually, the whole philosophy was sponsored by as many women as it was men, or as many men who had that feeling, because from the earliest time, the men voted for the whole family. And that's your blank. Number 1, your whole family. Father, mother, children. He was voting for the whole family. A lot of women thought that it was not right to fragment it and have a divided vote. But finally, guess who gave the women the right to vote? Now, I want you girls to fess up now. Who gave the women the right to vote? Well, it was those chauvinistic piglets. Isn't that something? That's who it was. It was those men. Well, we just want you girls to know that a lot of us men really appreciate you. And one of the big arguments why the men gave the women the right to vote, they passed around the word, the women will clean up politics. And girls, I want to know when you're going to start. We need it. We really do. So number 2 is politics. I just want you to be sure that you knew why we gave you that wonderful privilege of voting with us. It's so you'd help us clean up politics. Well, the 19th Amendment went into effect August 26, 1920. And my goodness, we thought the girls would get right out there and vote in a quantity, and they didn't. We thought they'd vote at least equal to the number of men, and that's capital A, equal, but they didn't. The women's vote has never been equal to the men's vote, and that's just not right. And so we're hopeful you girls will get in there now and at least equal the men's votes. In fact, we're having a hard time getting people to vote at all. Do you know that in the average municipal election, if you get 25% out, you're lucky? And so that means the decision isn't made by a majority of the people, made by a very minor group of the people, maybe half of 25%. Just 12 or 13% made the decision. That's not America. And de Tocqueville warned us that we might become so prosperous someday that we just take our system for granted. Now, we've really been agitating out west to get people out, get them out to vote. In Idaho and Utah, we average around 80% in a presidential election. Now, down in the states where they've only had one party for many years, it's down as low as 29%. 29%. So, capital B is 80%, capital C is 29%. All right, now the 20th Amendment. We can cover this one rather quickly. It was the 20th century and modern transportation that allowed this particular change. In the beginning, the founders were living in the horse and buggy days, and it took a long time to get ready, to get started, to commence, to begin to do something. So they'd have everybody in Congress meet in December, early December, to get ready for the president's inauguration on March the 4th. Well, you don't need that much time today, and so capital A is March the 4th. And so this amendment changes it to have Congress meet January the 3rd, number 3, January 3, to get ready for the president's inaugural on January the 20th. Now, that's my birthday. I thought it was so nice of them to select that date. Now, this new arrangement eliminated the influence of congressmen and senators who had been defeated in the previous November. So you put in there defeated. They were always referred to as lame duck senators, lame duck congressmen. And so this is called the lame duck amendment. It was definitely an improvement. So Roman numeral II, that blank is defeated. All right, now the 21st Amendment I've already referred to, that's the repeal of prohibition. The amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, and that's your blank. But it didn't legalize alcohol. It didn't legalize it. All it did was to turn liquor back to the control of the states. And we see all these lovely ladies here now drinking beer legally when this amendment was finally passed. And it still made it illegal to transport liquor across state lines in violation of any state laws. So there still are some federal laws connected with alcohol. But it's left it up to the states. But we never have gotten as well off as we were back in 1916 when 19 states had elected to keep alcohol under control. And you should know that the worst form, the most extensive form of drug addiction today is alcohol. And it causes more deaths, more misery than any other thing that we have by way of drug addiction, much more than LSD and some of these other things. So it's just something to think about, because you don't want to tread on the rights of other people. But we need to be very realistic about the impact which alcohol is having on our society. All right, the 22nd Amendment it limits the president to 2 terms. Now, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, they were only going to let a president serve 1 term. But then guess what? When they were in the convention, Washington voted against 1 term. So they said he probably thinks he needs more than 2, because everybody, or more than 1, because everybody knew that he would be elected president. So they just left it open. They didn't put any limitation on the term. And Washington only served 2 terms, Jefferson 2 terms. Each of the presidents thereafter who served more than 1 term only served 2, until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he was the first. So under Roman numeral I, will you put single? Single. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was during a war and everything, and Harry Hopkins and others said, President, stay in there, we need you. And so the president ran 2 terms, then a 3rd term, and the 4th term. So Roman numeral II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first one to run more than 1 term. That is to be president more than 2 terms. Now I'm saying it right. And Roman numeral III, he died at the beginning of his 4th term. Now, immediately after the war, the Republican Party won both houses, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so this amendment was passed so that it could be adopted by the states, and was done so that we now can only have a president serve in 2 terms. All right? Now the 23rd Amendment. 23rd Amendment is the presidential electors for the District of Columbia. And I'll tell you, the Founding Fathers would have taken a dim look at this one. It would have been very suspect, and that's your first blank, suspect. Because they were trying to keep these 10 square miles non-political. They didn't want them to become politicalized. They wanted them exclusively under the political control of Congress, so there wouldn't be the kind of violence they had in Philadelphia when it was the capital. And so Roman numeral I is suspect, and capital A is violence. Now, there are 800,000 people in Washington, D.C. They ought to have a right to vote in a presidential campaign. It could have been done very easily by allowing them to vote with Maryland, which this territory originally belonged to. But no, they went for an amendment to give them an opportunity to elect electors for a president and vice president. And it looked as though they were trying to set up the District of Columbia as a state, and that's your blank, capital C, state. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they were trying to do, get the District of Columbia all of the representative advantages of a state without it ever becoming a state. And so Congress in 1978 passed an amendment to the Constitution giving the District of Columbia, 800,000 people, 2 senators, and a congressman, in direct violation of everything that the Founding Fathers had in mind when they set up the Constitution. But it went through. Congress put it through. That is 2/3 of the House and the Senate. But now that it's out among the states, I think they recognize that this is not a good trend. New York will be next, and then Chicago wants to be a state with its 2 senators. It would fragment the whole country. So as a result today, only, so far as I know, 8 states have ratified that particular amendment. And so if you put in 8, please. Now the 24th Amendment is the poll tax amendment. And down south, particularly, they used to have a poll tax to cover the cost of elections, and that's your blank, cost. And it was only $2 or $3, but at the same time, it kept a lot of poor whites and poor blacks from voting. And so if you put in poor whites and poor blacks for Roman numeral II, and therefore they passed this particular act that made it illegal to preclude somebody from voting just because they hadn't paid a tax of some kind. That's what that's all about. All right, now the 25th Amendment is to fill vacancies for the office of President and Vice President. I think this will really surprise you. The first section of this amendment wasn't really necessary. It said if the president becomes sick or dies or is incapacitated, the vice president takes his place. Well, that's already in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6. So that really wasn't necessary. Now, Section 2 states that if the office of vice president becomes vacant, the president appoints the new vice president. Capital A, the president appoints a replacement for the job of vice president. And B, the person who's been appointed is confirmed by merely a majority of the House and the Senate. And that's a lot easier than getting 2/3 of the Senate to approve. All right, Section 3 allows the president to voluntarily relinquish his office if he's sick or indisposed and let the vice president take over temporarily. And when he feels better, he can go back in and take it over, and the vice president must step down. Must is Roman numeral 3 blank. He must step down. All right, now Section 4 is a different ball game. I want you to notice this one particularly. It provides that if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet or some monitoring body set up by Congress, the vice president and majority of that body decide the president is incapacitated, the vice president can go in the White House and take over as acting president, whether the president likes it or not. Now, capital A, notice that the initiative for unseating the president is in the vice president, backed by a mere majority of the cabinet or such other review board as Congress sets up. And capital B, after the president has been ousted and the vice president has assumed power, the president can advise the leaders of Congress that he is really able to discharge these duties. So he can object. But notice this, capital C. The vice president then has 4 days to respond. And meanwhile, the vice president continues to act as our president. Acting president. Capital C, acting president. Now, capital D, if the vice president still thinks the president is incapacitated in spite of his claims, he advises the leaders of the House and the Senate that he does not agree with the president and he's going to continue serving as president, acting president, until they review it. And they have 21 days. That's capital D was still. Capital E was 21. The Congress has 21 days, and if they're not in session, they have 4 days to reconvene and then 21 days to look this thing over. And capital F, after an appropriate inquiry, then the Congress decides. And to keep the president out takes 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree that the president should not serve. Otherwise, he eventually, you see, gets to come back. Well, this just creates a tug of war between the president and his vice president. And a vice president with any kind of ambitions could betray his president. My goodness, think what would have happened in the days of Abraham Lincoln if this had been the case. Many times he made his most important decisions with his whole cabinet against him, and the public also. One day his secretary came in and said, "Mr. Lincoln, you have the distinction of being the most unpopular man in the United States." And he said, "I have only one concern. It is not to be popular." but to be right. Another time, one of his cabinet members said, "Mr. President, with the kind of decisions you're making, pray God is on your side." President Lincoln said, "No, I only pray I'm on God's side." That was Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents. And I just want to show you what this kind of an amendment can do under circumstances when the man that's been elected by the people's electors is subject to a vice president and a majority of the cabinet ousting him. All right, let's see if we got all our blanks there. Number 6, this amendment was pushed through Congress in 1965, ratified in 1967, and it is considered one of the poorest examples of legislative writing in recent years. Poorest is your blank. One of the poorest examples. And then capital A, of course, was President Lincoln. President Lincoln. I just want to say a few things about that great man whom I've learned to love as I've read his writings and his life. All right, it is believed that this amendment encouraged the political maneuvering which gave the United States, for the first time in its history, an unelected president, and an unelected vice president. President Ford and Nelson Rockefeller. That's an interesting study all by itself, which we don't have time to cover. All right, very quickly now, the last amendment to the Constitution to date is the 26th, and that's the right of 18-year-olds to vote. 18-year-olds to vote. Well, what about that? That went through faster than any amendment that was ever proposed, more quickly, and that's your blank, more quickly than any amendment that was ever proposed. And let me read it to you. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. That's it. And so we might just comment here on the past. Traditionally, a young man was considered to be mature and responsible at the age of 21. And yet we've often drafted them at 18, and it was an old Anglo-Saxon thesis: if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. So there was a real great drive to get the 18-year-old vote in. The question really was not the 18-year-old, it was the people that were backing this particular amendment. Because this came up, you'll remember, right at the time that we had a tremendous amount of rioting and violence, and a great many young people had become involved. And it was thought that the people that were sponsoring this were trying to get in a block vote of young people that had become inflamed and radicalized, etc., and that it was taking advantage of their immaturity at that time. Because it is true, as all students of maturation know, that there is quite a change between 18 and 21. So, capital B, did you get 21 down? Did you get 21 down? All right, capital C, all of the fears that many people had expressed did not happen. And that's your blank. They didn't happen. The young people didn't vote as a block, and that's B-L-O-C. It's that kind of a block, B-L-O-C. All these fine young people, they didn't vote as a block. As a matter of fact, they were as reluctant to get out and vote as their parents had been. We're trying to get 18-year-olds to vote now, just like we are their parents. And I tell you, those young people who are voting and who are studying, who are attending our seminars, they're some of our finest workers. I'm proud of them. So number 2 is parents. We're all about in the same boat on that. So the vote of 18-year-olds has not changed the political spectrum any more than women's suffrage did. And this is quite different than many had expected. And that's your blank, expected. Now, isn't that interesting? Now we have a lot of other people who are contemplating amendments, and there are some that we need, like the Judicial Reform Amendment, etc. We'll be coming up with that in due time. But now as we come to the conclusion, let me just remind you what we've done in this seminar, as we've been together for about, 13 or 14 hours. We tried to refresh our memories. Will you read it with me in your outline? Our purpose has been to refresh our memories on the American heritage and the background of the American Founding Fathers, and to rediscover the great strength of the founders, their original success formula for freedom, prosperity, and peace. And number 3, to gain a better understanding of how certain forces have been trying to destroy the Constitution and substitute their own formulas of government and economics. And number 4, to appreciate why those substitute formulas have failed. And finally, to gain a better understanding of what each person can do to restore the Constitution in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. I want to just mention something briefly to show you how much hope there is in this kind of program. We're now spreading all over the United States, and there are a lot of other groups doing the same. And we're teaching people how to phase out these failure formulas and bring the full force and effect of the original Constitution back into power. You'll like it. For example, right at the beginning, you would start deregulating business so we can get a dynamic economy going. And you would allow young people to work again. There are 2 or 3 bills, 2 or 3 acts that need to be nullified to get young people back into the act. We need to have our money on a sound basis once again. We need to get it back where when you save it in your youth, you know it'll be worth that much when you retire. And that can be done by getting it back into precious metals. If you put our money back on the market value of our gold, we can go back with no difficulty. It's amazing some of the things that we could do. Social Security, you see it's bankrupted itself. Is there an answer? I'll tell you there is. And we would get, over a period of about 10 years, you'd get all the new Social Security going into annuity funds. And the government would have to continue helping those they promised to help. But eventually you reach a place where everybody has their Social Security as a matter of right. You don't have to be poor to get Social Security. It's yours. You earned it. And you get it as a matter of right. See, that's a great system. And the money goes into the investment of our great American industrial complex. So that between 25 and 65, you build up an estate of about $250,000. And you don't retire on a pittance that won't even pay your rent. You retire at about $1,200 a month in good dollars. You see, there are better plans, there are other plans. And at the same time, we'd start reducing income taxes, getting them down. We've got a lot of ideas and plans that will be very thrilling as we get a chance to explain them to people and eventually elect a constitutionally oriented Congress that will do it. That's really all we need. And based on the last voting record, do you know that in our House of Representatives of 435 members, we only need 45 more to have a majority that think along the lines that I've been explaining to you. In the Senate, we need 29 to have a majority, but it isn't impossible. And any of you who'd like to have a seminar in your community where we can come out and teach it for you or send the tapes, whichever you'd like, write to us. Our address is given at the end of the program. And thank you for being with us.